You're listening to A Second Look on the Orca. A second look is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on past events, unpack their significance, and discuss their long-term implications. A second look is intended to give thoughtful reflection on issues that made the headlines and elicited strong responses as a society. What did we think then? What do we think now? What have we learned? And now, your host, Justin Goodrich.
Welcome to another edition of A Second Look here on the Orca. I'm your host, Justin Goodrich. On this month's edition of A Second Look, we'll be discussing the events of September 11th, 2001, and their impact on the world. Here to take a second look at the events of that day and how they've shaped the past 20 years is former Canadian diplomat turned academic, Diego Osorio. Joining me today from the Netherlands, Diego spent 23 years in a variety of capacities with Global Affairs Canada, including Senior Peacekeeping Officer and Senior Advisor on Mediation, Negotiations, and Peace Processes. Presently, he's an advisor in the private and public sector, as well as an adjunct professor and research fellow of public policy and international justice studies. Welcome to the program, Diego.
Thank you very much, Justin. It's a pleasure to be with you here and your audience.
Well, thank you so much. Let's dive right into it, Diego. Last month, we celebrated, for lack of a much better term, the 20-year anniversary of the events of 9/11. And I thought it would be perhaps appropriate to begin our conversation by reflecting on that very day. Wondering if you recall where you were that day and how you learned of the attacks in New York.
Yes, I do. To the detail, actually. I was at the time a project manager for the Pearson Peacekeeping Center in Nova Scotia. And it was a rural part of Nova Scotia. And I was just getting a FedEx box. When I went to pick it up, the guy from FedEx said, "You hear about what happened in New York?" And then I immediately took the box, went to see the TV. Everybody was watching. And what I remember was the sense of apocalyptic, time-changing, and uniquely singular experience of saying history is divided in two pieces, before and after. And then, as I start hearing some of the analysis, this kind of very important realization or this gut feeling that I was going to be involved somehow in this. And yes, it did happen that a few weeks after, I was getting deployed to Afghanistan and Pakistan to be part of the humanitarian and the reconstruction operation involved with this whole thing afterwards. So it was a matter of a few weeks, and then I was already in the middle of the action on this particular operation.
Wow. Wow. I can't imagine the notion of you see something on TV and you think to yourself, somehow I'm going to be a part of that, and then be deployed a few weeks later. That's
right. And please do not think it's a sense of unwarranted self-importance. It was more like this very unique gut feeling that, gosh,
sure,
something's going to change here. Life is really moving tracks, and I know that I'm going to be part of this. And yeah, I mean, by the end of the day, you were watching the buzz of emails and people and everybody preparing things, and this is going to happen and stuff. And once you're part of the work of humanitarian development operations in fragile and conflict states, it becomes part of your community. And my community was talking, and so I saw that something was going to happen. And the other thing was, and I don't know if others saw it, but there was a very, very gentle, very nice Somali intern at the Pearson Peacekeeping Center at that moment. And somehow I made immediately the connection with the fact that this was going to be very difficult for people of the Muslim faith in some cases because of the backlash that will probably emerge out of this. And my first thing was, I don't remember her name, but I told her, if anybody says anything to you, if you get harassed or if you get said, if you've been told anything about this related to this particular situation, if you experience some sort of discrimination, you let me know. And this is the first thing that I mentioned to her, because I knew this was going to emerge somehow. It was just natural, and people act in the heat of the action and stuff. And yeah, those two things were very much marking my first reactions to the moment. Yeah.
Let's move a little bit past that first day. So you have this gut feeling that somehow you're going to be potentially involved through your role as a diplomat. You have an immediate care and concern for your colleagues, which speaks to the man that I've gotten to know. But it's a few days later now, and there's conspiracies and rumors and the very beginnings of what would become a very Islamophobic type discourse in certain segments of society. So now it's a few days, a week after the attacks take place. Now what's going through your head? Is it the same as before? Is it a little more developed, more concerns, different concerns? What was that? Well, tell my listeners about the evolution of your thinking.
Yeah, you see, I would not say that back at the time I was a very experienced diplomat. I had been already in 2 missions overseas, and I was doing this work for Canada in Nova Scotia, and I had some expertise, but I was still in the junior end of the framework of professional development. But one thing that had been part of my analytical framework before I started doing this work and after was the cyclical and repetitive nature of how policy develops and emerges, and how we are so prone to make the same mistakes in a kind of cyclical thing. It's like, do we learn about things? Do we carry on institutional memory? Why is it they're making the same mistakes as before? And I remember that was one of the marking elements was back at the time of the Operation Desert Storm, when George Bush went into Kuwait and everything. There was this sense of taboo that we used to think back then, between the Cold War and the beginning of this new world, that a war in the Middle East was like opening the Pandora box. After that, it's going to be really messy, right? That was back in 92, 93. Then we are in the year 2000, and we have this new thing. It's like, what, we opening this Pandora box again? Gee, what's going to happen? And then you start seeing how policies frame it, and you see how simplistic the narrative has become. Us against them, this and that, action. I mean, I don't want to diminish the very basic sense of fear that this operation had on people, right? And that was very legitimate, and Canada was a great actor in supporting that in that phase. But at the same time, us against them, and let's just invade and let's just do these things without thinking about it. It's like, we're going to make the same mistakes. At the time, I had already come back from Kosovo and Timor-Leste. And in those 2 places, I have seen how we put so much emphasis on what we think the problem is, instead of actually trying to define the problem for what the evidence suggests is going to be. And so we have this normative, I want to shape your reality so that it fits with my interests. And within that framework, I say, well, Kosovo worked more or less well because the Kosovars were pretty much interested in making sure it works, not because the framework of policy was making sure that there was going to be a success story. And then I saw this copy paste of so many things: development projects, humanitarian action, framing of policy. That was, stuff I have seen in places like Kosovo, more or less being transposed onto what's going to happen in Afghanistan. And I was part of that process as well, because obviously I wouldn't have the power to change things, but I was part of the funding, development of projects, development of operations, deployments, and things like that were happening in the place. And then one key thing was, this is not going to work. We are basically copying the cookbook from something that worked before, in which we were not 100% sure why it worked. And then we're going to use it into a new place where the social dynamics, the anthropological, the sociological dimensions are completely different. And and I'm a historian. And one thing that really strikes me is that we don't pay attention to history. So we end up making the same mistake twice or three times or four times. And is in Afghanistan back then until today is a clear example of that tendency that we have in policy. And just to finish on that particular thing, years after, somebody far more articulate than me, as a doctor in political science, wrote a great book about the war in Iraq. Losing the war, losing the peace, winning the war, and it was about Iraq. And in the preface, he writes about this, about the fact that we tell ourselves the story so much and so often that we end up buying the Kool-Aid. And when we buy it, we actually try to force that onto the reality. And that's what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq in many ways.
Well, Diego, you've touched on several very interesting points. Certainly, this cookie cutter approach, the overall narrative, this idea of convincing oneself. I don't even. I'm not even sure where to begin. It's striking that we're having this. We are recording this podcast and having this conversation the same day that Colin Powell passed away, former United States Secretary of State, I believe.
Yeah.
And of course,
chief of the army as well in the search.
Right. Chief of the Army, and I think he went on to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in fact.
Yeah, that's
and so we have this individual who, from a narrative perspective, was essentially tasked with selling that narrative to the United Nations and the justification for the actions of the United States. So there's a lot of layers here, but I want to try and manage this conversation in a way that makes sense. So it's been a couple of weeks. You're getting this sense that we're potentially history's about to repeat itself. We're about to engage in activities that we've done before. But when the time actually came and the United States decided to go on the offensive, tell my listeners a little bit about that. What was going through your mind as the United States transitioned from having been attacked to now being retaliatory?
Right. Well, there were two tracks to this. On one side, you were very. I was very perplexed at the simplicity of the analysis that was framing huge operations and the amount of money that was being spent. Know that I could be in a position or the seniority of the experience to offer a counter narrative, but even I, this junior guy in the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan, could see that this was extremely simplistic. This is it. We're just going to go back, get rid of the Taliban. Then we're just going to bring elections, bring a state of rule of law, and we're just going to make the whole thing into a Jeffersonian democracy. And it's going to take us probably a year or two, and that's it. And we're going to adorn it with other nice little things like sending girls to school and things like that bring and carry favor among public opinion and other actors. But at the end of the day, it wasn't clear. And to honor Mr. Powell, the mission wasn't clear, therefore the exit strategy wasn't clear. He said something like that. I cannot paraphrase it, but I do remember that, the exit strategy requires a sense of why is that we're doing this and why, so we're gonna have a clear benchmark to get out. So, and when I refer to this, the evidence is, for instance, that a lot of money on a very wide array of different types of engagements, and this, to the credit of the United States, is a very generous country, and they did put a lot of resources and a lot of goodwill on to develop media, having better schools, changing departments and everything, but not done in a way in which they were looking at the result, which means that you take on the long priority, but on the short priority in which you, more than showing the result, you focus on showing that you're doing it, right? Because the cyclical electoral elements and other things, you need to show results on the short term, and that changes the entire framework. So there are things that are part of of my list of things that could be replicated, like the support to civil society, the support to media, radio programs and stuff like that. But there are other things in which how things were sequenced, right? This is Afghanistan. This is a country that's very different from others. People probably don't have enough to eat. There is a climate change climate change undercurrent in terms of this whole thing. The country is really not in good shape. You know, the electoral element, the elections, the constitution, that is part of the solution. But how we put them into first or second place might not have been focused on, which is the most important thing. Something to stick, you need to make sure that people buy it. And to buy it, you need to make sure that they have this, what I call the peace dividend. It's not my phrase, all the people have used it, but the peace dividend is, yeah, right, this process works and I'm gonna throw my lot behind it. But if you just have a great elections and a lot of interesting high-level political things, but the men and women of the street do not really see a substantial change, they're not behind it. And because they're not behind it, it's difficult to carry on. It's difficult to carry on the long term. So that's one of the things that that was very important. And the other thing, and perhaps for everybody else, is that the little we actually pay attention to what people want.
Interesting.
How we listen to people. Like if somebody comes to Kamloops to change the dynamics of the municipal government in Kamloops or North Vancouver, this will not be acceptable the way we do things in Afghanistan. You have these internationals that come and set up the agenda and do things, and we spend the money and off we go. And the Afghans just basically is like watching. You come this way, you go this way. Really, it's a little bit of a situation that if it wasn't so tragic, it would be comical in a way. Now, in full disclosure, I was part of the process. These are some reflections that are emerging now. Back then, I was a little bit more normative, and I was very much convinced that we had the secret to transform one country into another. And like me, many others, right? Although the sense of questioning was already there.
Well, so let's again, you you touch on these so many interesting elements, and I appreciate your authenticity by saying, I was part of the process, and at the time it seemed very normative, and it all made sense. I do want to probably close our time together talking about any thoughts or reflections you do have 20 years later. But for now, let's continue to walk down the path. So the United States is now engaged. We've got other international actors who are coming to the table. Let's bring the Canadian lens to it. So what did this mean for Canada?
Yes. It meant that we had to play a very difficult equilibrium. Afghanistan, for instance, was more of a clear-cut situation. And so off we went. On the other, Iraq was certainly not. And it's one of those things that everybody remembers how proud we were of our prime minister saying no. But the implications for Canada is that we do have a very black and white approach to things in some cases, very much shaped by our values, our desire to be a constructive force for good in the world, and the nuances that need to be kept in order to get at these situations with the right point of inflection, with the good sense of why is it that we're going in there and what we want to get out of it. It's needs a little bit more of of a very detailed development. And that, I think, um, I will not intend to criticize my colleagues. They're very capable people and they all did really well with the Canadian government and stuff. But yeah, we're just going to be there and do these certain things. And that's how we tell the Canadian public that we're going to bring little girls to school and stuff. Well, many empires have gone to Afghanistan, or Afghanistan has gone through many empires, rather.
Right.
And at the end of the day, people with a more detail and good sketching nature of the analysis of what this country is all about have failed at it. So we're good, well-intentioned, we aim well, we mean well, but perhaps a very we need to develop a more long-term sophisticated analysis in terms of what we want to achieve in these places, and also how that has an implication for the framework or the overall position of Canada, right? Because if you want to be very cynical about it, you say, well, we're doing Afghanistan because we did in Iraq, and our trade relations with the United States require a certain degree of commitment to something, and there's perhaps a bit of truth to that, but I wouldn't just say that we went into Afghanistan to keep the Windsor Bridge working, right, back and forth in terms of the industry. No, there's more to it, but we need to understand how going into Afghanistan is going to shape our own society, because Afghanistan is now part of the Canadian narrative. You have generations of soldiers that went there. You have many people that are suffering from PTSD. So this is not just something that happened during the years that we were there. Is the people that will be thinking, remembering, connected to Afghanistan for years and years. And imagine the impact, for instance, of what you hear today in the news. Today is the 18th of October. CBC journalist Susan Ormiston was saying something like, I was talking to the police commander of Kandahar, who used to be a Taliban commander fighting Canadian troops. Now, how does that resonate in the head of all those Canadians that were fighting this Taliban all over Kandahar? What an implication. Did we fail? Did we lose? Did we win? What did we achieve? And those are questions that require a lot of thinking. I believe, this is one phrase I always keep, that a country like Canada, because of its diversity, because of the nature, the emphasis we give to immigration and all these things, foreign policy for us is a nation building tool. We might not realize it. We might not consider it as such on a day-to-day basis. But for us, the way we do things outside is basically, quite frankly, a key element of how we're building the shop inside. And so whatever it is that we did with Afghanistan, we really need to understand the implications of that phenomenon at home. Because, for instance, are we now averse to engage into things that require engagement? How do we really going to position ourselves vis-a-vis the recent and the soon to come clear-cut situations in which you need to engage on this whole idea of responsibility to protect? The amount of violations of human rights, of terrible tragedies and things like that, that will require a country that means well to do something about it, are not going to stop, and they're going to multiply. But what are we going to do in those? Because we really throw the sink into the Afghanistan operation, and from many perspectives, it doesn't seem that we got much out of it. So I don't know. I have the feeling that we cannot do these things lightly. We cannot just engage on these things on short-term calculations. It has to be in the long term. What are the implications for Canadian society in the year 2024 that you had Canadian soldiers fighting in the streets of Kandahar in the year 2008? We need to remember these things. And for me, it's essential that we treat this with care and carefully, because the implications can be very serious for Canada.
Well, so you have discussed a couple of interesting elements here, from responsibility to protect,
We're
the
not using
notion.
that term that much anymore, but yes.
Yeah, but but it's two academics, R2P as we know it.
Yeah.
So responsibility to protect the reputational elements of Canada, the duty of care, if you will, in terms of rebuilding and helping an entire society, try to land on their feet and turn a corner that will hopefully be peaceful and productive. And yet, looking back 20 years later, to your point, did we accomplish what needed to be accomplished? And can we look back and feel good about our contribution to it all? And did we play a role in terms of establishing a healthy long-term outcome?
Well, I guess we saw it on the airport, and we saw how the whole thing evolved. That was not the case, and so it's something to consider.
No, it's most certainly something to consider. In your own experience, and I'm just going to ask you to offer a personal opinion, but in your own experience, first of all, what do you think is actually going to happen, in Afghanistan and in the Middle East? Is there any degree of optimism that things
Mm,
can get better, especially with the withdrawal of the United States?
yeah,
And then just any long-term foreign policy, implications that you can think of, in these final few minutes together.
yeah. Well, one thing that struck me was how quickly these other groups, like um, the Taliban, I happened to be in Iraq at the time where ISIS took over Mosul and parts of the north in the frontier between Syria and Iraq. I wasn't directly there, but it was part of the operation, and so I saw those things, and I saw how quickly not only we were in a fragile and conflict state situation, but basic parameters of governance fell apart. The decapitation of the director of a museum because these guys wanted to do a complete iconoclastic destruction of everything that was referring to what was not their own view of the very twisted version of Islam. I'm talking about ISIS. And so you can go from conflict onto a very different and barbarian type of situation. And my apologies for the scholars that taken a light sense of the word barbarian, but yeah, we can lose all parameters of civilization quite easily. And some actors have a very different view of the world and the future, and they're fighting for that. And we are not on that side. We are quite on the opposite. Now, ISIS was a caliphate in that part of the Middle East, and they tried to keep a piece of territory with an ideology and some parameters of a functioning bureaucracy. As evil as you might think it is, as twisted, there was a ministry of education, there was a ministry of water, there was a ministry of somebody picking up the garbage, all these elements. And so there was a beginning of a state, and it was quite advanced in certain parts with ISIS. It was so radical, and it led to so many reactions that at the end of the day, there was a big effort and we got rid of ISIS, the state. Now it's ISIS, the terrorist group. In the case of the Taliban, despite everything we said, we now have a de facto regime with more or less control on a territory, and is now potentially, it is currently arguing and it might potentially get some sort of recognition by other states. And so a country that believes that women should not get education, that death penalties by decapitation ipso facto, that all these things that are very much reference to medieval cruel events, this construct is slowly getting into the concert of nations. And if we have one, nothing prevents this phenomena from replicating. That for me is the huge thing, because all those forces, all those terrorist elements were ecstatic about the fact that the Taliban managed to get it done, to make it happen. And they say, yeah, nothing better to fight than to have hope, in the sense that you can do it too, right? Hope is what keeps you alive in the worst, darkest hours, more or less paraphrasing Churchill. Well, something like that happens in a situation like this. If the Taliban were able to manage, well, what prevents the guys in Mozambique, a very small insurrection of Islamic fundamentalists, to think that they could potentially get to that point? Or things happening in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. We don't know how this whole situation in Mali is emerging. On top of that, we have an overall evolution vis-a-vis climate change. And I'm quite frankly convinced that the destruction of the environment and climate change as such has such a direct implication on conflict that we're going to be dealing with more radical, more often, and larger size conflicts, in which these radical ideologies lend themselves to provide a way out, a way of not just accepting the day-to-day of a terrible situation. And this radicalization will prove very attractive for people that have no other hope. So, I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, but nothing in my very inexperienced analysis suggests that the Taliban will be the last one of this crop.
All right. Well, it's it's a little heartbreaking to know that things aren't necessarily better, that many sacrifices were made for what is a degree of instability at best, and the beginnings of setting a new tone internationally at worst, in terms of, as you say, when people don't have much to lose, and they
But I would like to say one thing. I mean, what is the silver lining on this? What is the optimistic way of flopping the question is that we are not condemned to keep making the same mistakes all the time. I mean,
we're not.
I mean, we have brains, right? We have a capacity to analyze what's happening. At least the mistakes are happening so often that at least we can see the results, right?
Sure.
It's not like we're dealing with Vietnam War vis-a-vis what happened in Afghanistan. It's like we had 3 or 4 of these more recent, and therefore we should learn from it. One thing is that we should not develop policy towards having the results we want. We should create policy to create the situations by which the people that happen to be in the middle of these regions, those who are really directly affected by these policies, can frame and can develop the policies and the engagements that will organically get them to do things. You know, nobody really got Western Europe out of war by having a lot of humanitarian agencies coming in. They just got out of it themselves. It took them thousands of years and many years of violence, et cetera. In this case, we don't necessarily need to reproduce the same thing and wait for 1,000 years before other parts of the world and get to a better shape. But it's not really to anyone. It's not up to anyone to tell them to become a Jeffersonian democracy, have elections and stuff like that. But we can enable people to be their own responsible owners of their own actions and of their own reconstruction process. That changes the amount of people that are going to be involved, the money, how it's going to be spent, the nature of development projects. It will offer much less chances for our prime minister to go and inaugurate a little bridge or a little school, but it might let us to have a bigger bang for the buck in some cases, and a more respectful one and a more sustainable one. We were spending too much time trying to build this normative result-oriented, the famous result-based management approach towards foreign policy. That doesn't work. It doesn't work because the world is not an economic model that responds to your 3 or 4 assumptions. This is a complexity. So if we take something from a complexity approach, from adaptive system approach, we don't know what's going to happen in the second and third iteration of how the system is moving. We can just be actors that facilitate opportunities for some of these forces for good to project themselves and to have a larger impact. And that, for me, if you take it into the maximum perspective and minimalist perspective, will fundamentally change the way we create policy, the way we implement policy, and the way we frame Canadian foreign policy. For me, Canada is a unique country, is a model of how the world could be, and I'm not ashamed of saying that. More than running ourselves by a set of very loose sense of where we were going, we could have one basic principle, the principle of human dignity. You know, we're going to do everything in respect to human dignity, and we will engage, we facilitate, all for human dignity. And within that, we will build a foreign policy that is, as I mentioned before, a nation-building tool for us Canadians.
Diego, it is always a delight to chat with you. And I'm so thankful that you've taken this time all the way from the Netherlands. I'm
baby in the background and everything.
Baby in the background. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I very much appreciate ending our time together with this notion of human dignity. I am like-minded with you that if we could look at all of the injustices and all the conflict around the world through the lens of human dignity, we could drastically and positively impact future generations for the entire world, frankly. And I thank you for your time today, Diego. It's been a genuine pleasure, and you've left me and no doubt my listeners with a lot to think about. So thank you so much.
It is an honor to be part of this, and my best regards to your audience. And hopefully, we're going to be keeping this debate going. And there's a lot of interesting policy engagements and initiatives that facilitate Canadians to discuss not just foreign policy, but foreign policy is really an extension of how we do policy at home, right? It should be that way. And I will just invite Canadians to understand more about others, because we have a very good franchise. This is a very good brand. We should really be proactively exporting it and pushing for it globally.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Diego. That brings us to the end of A Second Look. I'd like to thank my guest, Diego Osorio, for joining me today. If you have questions or comments about today's show or suggestions on future topics, you can email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Until next time, I'm Justin Goodrich. Thanks for listening.
The preceding program was brought to you by Alliance Public Affairs Group in association with Van Grio. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and share.